Yeah.
All right, so I'd like to begin our time together with a quote. It's on your handout. "We shall do a great deal for the science of aesthetics once we perceive not merely by logical inference, but the immediate certainty of intuition." If you were to just guess who said that, what would you say?
Is that Einstein?
Einstein? Okay, that's a good guess. Other guesses? Who says this?
Chesterton.
Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton. Okay, I like it. Any others? Friedrich Nietzsche. And I start with that quote because I think sometimes appearances can be deceiving. Now, some of you, very interestingly, we've got maybe a tech mogul, an idiot, Chesterton. It's interesting to sometimes look at something and go, who said this? What's the context of it? But frankly, I chose this because I read this and I thought to myself, there's some Orthodox I could hear saying this, right? Don't trust reason. It's all noose or something. Not untrue, but it needs some qualification, needs some explanation. And so in this course, which we'll have about 6 sessions of, I want to just sort of challenge that we can't rely on truisms of any sort. A class context, I think, always demands a certain kind of rational inquiry. And it's very easy, Christians of any stripe, to lapse into easy answers. As they always say, Sunday school answers, or even the easy Orthodox answers. And so I want to challenge us to not to do that as much as possible. For today, what I'd like to do is essentially summarize the class, summarize the major ideas of what I would like to talk about over our 6 sessions, and set up that inquiry. And so, because it's so much summary, it's going to feel like a lot. It's going to feel like there's a lot of ideas, and so I just want to sort of set up this idea. It is a lot, and that's why we're going to slowly unpack it as we go. And the other thing I'd like to say before beginning is, even though we don't have texts for this class, I didn't ask you to read anything, you don't have to read anything in principle. I'm a very text-focused guy. I like to read texts, I like to read them closely, I like to look at their context usually. We won't have time to read texts in their entirety, but you'll find I often quote stuff. I often like to point to texts, I often like my thoughts and our thoughts to be grounded in text, if for no other reason than that the people we're reading have sort of withstood the test of time. And that goes especially for the Holy Fathers, right? We call them Holy Fathers, and we talk about tradition precisely because we think that these are ideas worth knowing, worth thinking about, because they have withstood the test of time. But here's another question. This course is about beauty. What is beauty? Just initial sort of thoughts about what it is to be beautiful.
It's in the eye of the beholder.
It's in the eye of the beholder. Good. Other thoughts. They don't have to be your thoughts. They can just be things you've heard. What do you think of beauty? What do you think about?
Heartfelt action.
Heartfelt action. I like that. Heartfelt action. Eye of the beholder. Heartfelt action. Others? Nothing. Virtue. Oh, I definitely like that. Virtue. So, just so we're clear, we got a little bit of relativism. We got something about passion, I'd imagine. Something about character. Other thoughts about beauty.
Coherence.
Coherence. Say a little more. What do you mean by coherence?
Everything comes together. Makes sense.
Good. Okay, so there's a certain kind of, I'll add to you a little bit, coherence, a certain harmonious relationship in something.
Yeah.
Good. Other kind of canons of beauty. When we look at a beautiful piece of art or sculpture or what have you, piece of music, what are some things that we tend to be looking for when we say it's beautiful?
Symmetry.
Symmetry. Very good. Symmetry, proportion. Of course, this is sometimes tough when there's some music that's very disharmonious. And do we find it beautiful? Okay, I want you to kind of keep all of those. I mean, we could keep going, and I wish I had kind of my little whiteboard. I'd like to put those somewhere. But for now, kind of keep those in mind, because I think each of those is right in some way, as we'll see. Or at least it's been said by someone who at least is, seemingly intelligent. But here is a different question, and I need a volunteer who will just let me interrogate them, who is brave in this respect. Too bad it's you. So, why are you here? Why are you here today?
I want to learn about Christianity.
You want to learn about Christianity? Why?
Because I believe it can make me happy.
That was so quick. Dang, didn't expect that. That was glorious, because I think it can make me happy. That's all I was looking for, frankly. I could ask any of you the same question. I do this with my students all the time. Why are you here? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? And if you really interrogate that structure, I've never had them that quickly, frankly. I'm really surprised in sort of 3 steps. Usually, right, you'll get a whole litany, but you might say, I'm here because I think it will give me a good job. Well, why do you want a good job? Well, I think it'll make me some money. Why do you want money? Because I want to buy certain things. Why do you want to buy certain things? Because I think it will give me pleasure. Well, why do you want pleasure? Because I think it'll make me happy. This goes all the way back to Aristotle in the sense that we do things for the sake of some good, for the sake of some end. And so any seemingly finite object of our desire, say money, has a further end. I don't want money for its own sake. I want money because it can buy me something. And I don't want that thing for its own sake. I want it because it will give me comfort or something like this, or power or status. And I don't want those for their own sake. I want those because I think ultimately it contributes to my happiness. And happiness, in Greek eudaimonia, is our flourishing. And for the ancient philosophical tradition, this meant the good, as Aristotle says. All of our acts are for the sake of some good. But it's not just some good, some particular good. It's goodness as such I want. I want the good. I want the whole pie, not a piece of it. Because I know that all these desires I have ultimately have this singular aim. Call it happiness, call it the good, it doesn't matter. We have this structure. The structure of our reality, the structure of our desires, the structure of the ways we act, and why we do the things we do. And the good is the beginning and the end of all of that desire, right? Because I desire the good, it prompts me initially, it's because I'm seeking it, that I take that first step in desiring something. But then, of course, it's not just that discrete thing that I want, it's this further thing I want. And so, in the tradition that we're going to talk about, which is ultimately the Orthodox tradition, these become the highest categories. Things like goodness, truth, beauty, and oneness. Sometimes these are called the transcendentals in the Western tradition. But why are these the highest goods? And so I want to turn to this, our first quote. I guess it's our second quote. I meant to put some numbers next to this, so you'll have to forgive me. It would make it easier. But it's the Plato quote from the Republic. You might be familiar with this. Both knowledge and truth are beautiful things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. In the visible realm, light and sight are rightly considered sun-like, but it is wrong to think that they are the sun. So here it is right to think of knowledge and truth as good-like, but wrong to think that either of them is the good, for the good is yet more prized. Very classic passage of the Republic where Plato talks about the analogy of the sun. This will later go on in his allegory of the cave, where what we're doing is we're moving from shadows, of course, to higher and higher levels of reality. The shadow in the cave, to the things that cast those shadows, to things in the external world, to the reflections, ultimately to the sun itself. And the sun, as we know quite well, it's the cause of everything. It gives us sight to see, it causes nutrition and growth and everything, it provides food. Without the sun, we're doomed. And the sun is an analogy, Plato thinks, a visible analogy for something higher and more transcendent. In the intellectual realm, there is the good. In the same way, the good, the true, the beautiful, cause us to think, to know, to desire these higher order values. Again, not just these material things, but again, even a higher order value as simple as glory. It's like where you can't go to Walmart and get yourself some glory, right? You can't get yourself some fame, you can't get yourself some justice, some equality. These higher order goods are not found easily in the material world, and yet they are ultimately the objects of our desire. But I want to continue right there, just in that passage, I bring it up, you start to see already in Plato the connection between truth, beauty, and goodness. But then let's go a little further into this tradition. You have Plotinus. He's a 3rd century Platonist thinker. He says, all beings are beings by the one, both those which are primarily beings and those which are in any sense said to be among beings. For what could anything be if it were not one? Now let's also read this next passage with Proclus. For it belongs to the good to conserve all beings, What conserves and holds together the being of each, makes each thing complete. Goodness, then, is unification. In unification, goodness. So here we get a little more unpacking. You have the good, but then you start to get this idea of oneness. What do we mean by good? Something's good for you, or good for me, or good for that. A good cup of coffee, a good human being, a good squirrel. What it is, ultimate instruction, is some kind of unity, some kind of cohesion. I always joke, like, if you look at a squirrel, and you watch the squirrel climbing around, it's collecting acorns, it's mating, it's doing its thing, good squirrel. It's got a certain kind of unity, a certain kind of perfection, a certain kind of goodness. Squirrel goes up the tree, I've actually seen this from experience, jumps off the tree to its death, bad squirrel, right? Not functioning properly, something's wrong, disconnect within the squirrel, but it literally has turned into multiplicity, whatever you want to call it, splat, roadkill, it's done for. It's not good for that to happen to the squirrel. And so we see goodness and unity also go together. Let me give a different example. Virtue. What is virtue? Right? And we could talk, I got a whole class on virtue, but in its basic sense, virtue is the proper unity of you. Right? I have desires. Say desire for food, desire for sleep, desire for sex. But there's a proper unity, a proper ordering of that. And we call that proper ordering virtue. But notice, by virtue, I just mean goodness. And so, in this tradition, goodness and unity go together. But once we start to see that, goodness and unity go together, in fact, for you to exist at all, as Plotinus says, requires some unity. You are a unity of parts. And if you lose those parts, you literally decay, you die. And so, for you to exist is already to have some kind of oneness, some kind of goodness. But that means truth. Because if you exist, you're true, certainly. You stand out. I can look at you right now and go, there he is. Right? He stands out from non-being, from non-existence as this kind of thing in the world. It's not false. And interestingly enough, there's a Greek, the Greek aletheia literally means to unconceal, to be unhidden. So something stands out from non-existence, says, here I am, I'm this kind of thing, I have this kind of unity, this kind of goodness. Oneness, goodness, truth. And now maybe at this point you're like, man, it's going on about all these things. We haven't talked about beauty yet. But here it is. Beauty, at least in some basic sense, is a kind of delight in that. Here's another quote from Plotinus. It's something we become aware of even at first glance. When it sees something akin to it, or a trace of its kindred reality, is delighted and thrilled, and returns to itself, and remembers itself in its own possession. Here, Plotinus is talking about those few moments when something in the world, its goodness, its unity, its truth, wakes us up. It reminds us about something of ourselves, and it delights us. It's a kind of internal delight, a recognition. It's like you see something of yourself in it, or better yet, it reminds you of something in yourself. In this case, what I want to say is that when we encounter truth, goodness, beauty, we encounter God. And in encountering God, we encounter ourselves, and in that encounter, we experience delight. And we, you might say, wake up. We wake up to reality as it is supposed to be. And this, at least I believe, most of us have experienced in some small way in our life. You would not be here if you didn't. There's that some primordial experience of those things. I want to now quote the philosopher, as controversial as he sometimes can be, David Bentley Hart, but The Experience of God is a fantastic book. And here's what he has to say. I love this. This waking up, the experience of God, is the experience of God's glory. Now listen to this. I may be speaking of something that escapes exact definition here, but it seems clear to me that the special delight experienced in the encounter with beauty is an immediate sense of the utterly unnecessary bareness, so to speak, of a thing. The simple gratuity with which it shows itself, or better, gives itself. To see the world with the eyes of innocence, and so to see it pervaded by a numinous glory, is to see things as they truly are, and to recognize creation as the mirror of God's infinite beauty. What we get there You see it all. Beauty as delight. Beauty as encounter. Beauty as the there-ness of things. Truth, it's standing out to us, waking us up. And that is nothing other than the numinous glory, that heart says, of God. A recognition that creation is finite. Creation is not for its own sake. Creation reflects something more than itself. And even if we can't articulate what that is, we have that experience. The experience that whatever it is that's prompting us, delighting us, waking us up is pointing beyond. We're not satisfied to stop there. We don't take a taste of beauty and go, okay, I've had my fill, see you later, have a good class. No. And this is because being, existence, beauty is theophany. It's a manifestation of God. And I want to say a little bit about, you see a lot of, again, set up here, lots of Plato and Plotinus and so on. This initial idea of beauty as theophany, say, what exactly is doing the waking up that I'm talking about? What exactly is it that you're delighting in? Goes all the way back to, as I said, Plato, with this idea of form. Forms, maybe, I don't know how many of you have taken like a college philosophy class, everyone knows Plato's forms, ethereal chairs floating out in space or something like this. This is a very bad account of Plato, as you'll see shortly. But what he means by form, and the Greek, or, the English, I should say, does not capture the Greek, the eidos of something, the idea of something, where we get our word idea is a better word, the forms are Plato's ideas, is the look of something. So everything has a form. This has a form, right? The form of table. If I asked you, what is this? You would immediately, or I guess it's a stand, right? That's a human. That's the floor. Here's a column. There's a camera, right? The form presents itself to us, and is what makes it intelligible to us, makes it knowable. It brings itself to our awareness. And for Plato, and this would go on to have enormous ramifications for the whole history of philosophy and theology, all of reality, all of existence is form. What does that mean? All reality is an idea. And it didn't take long for someone to say, whose idea was it? Ideas belong to a mind. Ideas, intelligibles, are intellected. They're thought about. They don't just float around in the ether. And so eventually, you start to get the sense that all of reality is not just idea. Everything you see, everything that has a definition, everything that's given to your mind is real, it's external to you, it's also deeply inward to you, but as I've said, it belongs to someone else. And when you come to think that idea, this is so radical in my mind, but it just blew me when I was a young man. Every time you think something, if it's someone else's idea you're thinking, then you're thinking with them. That is, you're participating in their life, in their mind. In the same way that when we speak to each other, I share ideas with you, we communicate, we dialogue, we have a relationship, we participate in each other's life. And when you think what I'm saying, just like you're doing right now, our minds are linking up. We are sharing, we are communing with each other. I want to quote Eric Pearl. He has a great book, Theophany, to really hammer home this idea of being as theophany. Where among the beautiful things in the world is beauty? Everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere, and that wherever there is a beautiful thing, there is beauty, capital B. As the nature which it has by which it is beautiful. Nowhere, in that as one universal intelligible nature, it is other than the many beautiful things and is not confined to any one of them. The form's transcendence is thus a strict implication of its immanence. The instances depend on the form to be such as they are, while the form, as a unitary intelligible nature capable of appearing in many instances, is independent of them. Now that's just what a philosopher would write. So what's he mean? When I experience a cat, and I have two of them, I experience one reality, catness. I suspect that you and I, when I say the word cat, you know exactly what I mean. You're not confused about what I'm saying I have in my possession. And you might have one too. There's one intelligible nature cat. When you see a cat, catness appears to you. And yet, I have a cat, I have two cats, you have a cat, maybe, right? And yet, one reality, many instances. One idea, many instantiations. In this case, what Pearl is getting at is what's true of cats. It's true of everything, but it's true of beauty as well. Beauty, if I just move quickly into this Christian idea, is God's idea. It's not just God's idea, it's who God fundamentally is. And yet, he shows up in beautiful things. And yet when I see something beautiful, whether it's a beautiful painting or icon or music, I at the same time recognize it as beautiful, and yet doesn't exhaust beauty. I don't go, that's the only beautiful thing that exists, right? No, it shows in some way, in a finite way. And yet I know that that's not beauty. And I know that about justice, I know that about truth, I know that about goodness. We are looking, ultimately, again, for beauty as such. And it's these things in the world which lead us to it, and I still want to emphasize, genuinely show it to us. And so in this tradition, and again, we'll spend time unpacking this, we say, what's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of existence? What's the stuff about? You would say, ultimately, to exist, to be, is to be intelligible, to be knowable, right? You're an idea. It's to be one. You have a particular kind of unity or oneness appropriate to you, which is also your goodness, your truth, and your beauty. And that somehow these things run across each other. And so when I experience something, I experience it as true, as standing out. I experience it as this one thing it is. I recognize the goodness in it. And that delights me if I'm properly attuned to it. If I see it as situated in this network of other ideas and things, and I come to see that that one little thing is somehow reflecting the grand scheme, so to speak, all of the ideas of God, what some of you might know, like Maximus the Confessor called the logi, or the logoi of God, God's words. Okay. I want to suggest a two-prong approach here then. First, there is the experience of beauty. And this experience is one of delight, as I've already suggested, but also joy. And we'll see in Dionysius the Areopagite, ecstasy. Beauty, as I said, wakes us up. It calls us out of ourselves. And that's what it is to be woken up. To stop being selfish, to stop being internal, to stop being focused, egotistical. Beauty suddenly makes me stand out of myself and go, whoa, what is that and how can I come to know it? I want to leave myself in some sense to know this thing, to commune with this thing, to partake of this thing, this ecstasy, this joy. But then there's the response to beauty. And that response, I suggest, includes devotion. Again, I'm going out of myself in an act of devotion. I want a piece of it. I want a piece of the beautiful. And what technically might be called cult, right? But in that sort of technical sense of liturgy, of ritual, it's a specific kind of devotion, we want to sacralize this thing. And we're standing in this beautiful space which testifies to that reality that here, in the wood, in the icons, in the painting, in the iron, in the space itself, we are attempting to devote ourselves to beauty. To elicit beauty, to call beauty down, to invoke beauty to come and meet us here. That's the natural response. And part of that response is countenance, the change in our countenance, the experience of another's countenance and encounter. It's personal, as I've said. I mean, you'll see these all hang together. Beauty as joy, delight, ecstasy calling me out of myself. I respond in devotion. I want to sacralize it. I want to make things. I want to call beauty down to myself. I want to encounter it. I want to change my life in light of it. Now, what motivates this? Easy enough for the Orthodox, theosis. But theosis didn't come from nowhere. Christ did not emerge out of a vacuum. Christ fulfilled all things. Christ met human longing where he made it to meet him. And so look at Plato. That is why a man should make all haste to escape from earth to heaven. And escape means becoming as like God as possible. And man becomes like God when he becomes just and pious with understanding. or Aristotle in his Ethics. But we must not follow those who advise us, being men, to think human things, and being mortal of mortal things, but must, so far as we can, make ourselves immortal. Or Cicero. The person who knows himself will first recognize that he has something divine, and will think that his own reason within himself is a sort of consecrated image of the divine. He will always do and think things worthy of this great gift of the gods. And when light has been cast on them under the guidance of wisdom, he recognizes that he is a good man, and for that reason he perceives that he will be blessed. Right there, just in those three. Plato says, let's make ourselves like God. Aristotle says, let's make ourselves immortal. Cicero says, recognize you have a divine image in you. That should, sound some alarms. The Imago Dei, made in the image of God of Genesis. And then, of course, our own tradition, which takes everything from the scriptures and the philosophers and says all of that longing is in Jesus Christ. So you have someone like Athanasius. Classically, God became man so man might become God. But more importantly, more crucially, Jesus himself. Matthew 5, blessed are, etc., etc. The poor, the meek, the humble. That word blessed, makarios, right, is the life of the gods. When Cicero and Aristotle and Plato talk about blessedness, which they do, you see it in Cicero, they mean having something with the life of the gods. And Jesus says something pretty radical when he's sitting saying his Beatitudes, that this is what it means to have blessedness, the life of a god. We desire God, ultimately. We desire paradise. And that's what motivates us in our encounter with beauty. Because when we see beauty, when we delight in it, when we're called out of ourselves, I could repeat myself over and over again, we are ultimately being prompted to recognize our most human desire is none other than commune with God, to be blessed. The radicality of Christianity, to turn to it, and we'll dedicate a whole session to this, is that paradise, blessedness, is in the crucified Lord, right? Today you will be with me in paradise, the Lord says to the thief. And that is very radical. That is something Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero could never have fathomed. Certainly not. The crucified Lord is where blessedness is found, where union with God is found. And here will be more radical. All this idea about symmetry, harmony, proportion. Where is that on the cross exactly? And so even Christianity begins to radicalize the encounter of beauty. And we'll talk about that as well. Now, participation in Christ transforms everything. What's the payoff here? We're talking abstractly, talking about Plato forms and all these different categories, goodness, truth. But really, at the end of the day, as we see in the Fathers and Jesus himself, we desire beauty because it transforms us again, makes us blessed, makes us like God. And here is Gregory of Nyssa on the making of man. We therefore say that the mind, as being in the image of the most beautiful, itself also remains in beauty and goodness, so long as it partakes as far as is possible in its likeness to the archetype. But if it were at all to depart from this, it is deprived of that beauty in which it was. And as we said, the mind was adorned by the likeness of the archetypal beauty, being formed as though it were a mirror to receive the figure of that which it expresses. We consider that the nature which is governed by it, is attached to the mind, is in the same relation, and that it too is adorned by the beauty the mind gives, being, so to say, a mirror of the mirror. Nyssa is talking about when we come to participate in God, having his image, coming into his likeness, it's not just merely abstract mental exercises. It transforms our mind, our soul, our bodies even. And that idea will find itself all the way through the great fathers. Maximus, all the way to St. Gregory Palamas, who, of course, defending the hesychast says, this transforms your body. The saints are totally transformed. And that is going to happen to all creation. Creation, to riff off of Nyssa here, will be a mirror of the mirror, right? In this case, the mirror of creation will be a mirror of us, who is a mirror of God. So in summary, I think I put this on your handout because it's a mouthful. This is my account. Beauty delights. It is the experience of transcendent form. These forms are God made manifest in the world, that is Theophany. This delight wakes us up to our truest selves, beckons us to God, ignites our innermost desire for participation in communion with God, that is theosis. Moreover, the true sight of this experience, how do you get some of this, right, is Jesus Christ, the true archetype of man, the full revelation of God. And our experience of Christ is fundamentally liturgical, sacramental, and iconic. That's my thesis, let's say. I'm going to try to prove it to you, to demonstrate it in the rest of our time together through the coming weeks. Now, I'd like to conclude with a little bit of about 20 minutes here, talk about modernity. Because I'm not just going to talk about ancient philosophy or the church fathers or scripture. I want to talk about where we're at now and how we got here and why it's so different than the vision of the church and of the Holy Fathers. And that, of course, has something to do with modernity. And I asked some of you at the beginning of this, our time today, what you thought beauty was. And I got lots of answers. Eye of the beholder, symmetry, proportion, coherence, something about passion, if I recall, certain kind of, and right, there's something there. But interestingly, some of those have some classical antecedents, no doubt, but a lot of those are modern. And so I have this little graph for you, and it's, in something like 20 minutes, I can't possibly, with all the nuance, each of these philosophers, thinkers, very nuanced thinker, and I could qualify in all kinds of ways, but I want to give the kind of gist, right, of some of these thinkers, what we might consider their theory about beauty, and kind of an explanation of that. And I hope you'll begin to see why this is so radically different than the Orthodox view of beauty. I actually start with Aquinas, maybe unfairly in some ways. I mean, Aquinas in some ways is following Aristotle, and Aristotle in some ways following Plato. But Aristotle does, unlike Plato and unlike the rest of the Platonists, tend to think of beauty as ultimately a kind of formal question, right, in terms of symmetry, proportion, and so on. Aquinas, masterfully to his credit, does think that we can explain beauty by these formal categories. And so you might call his theory a kind of formalism or objectivism. I named these myself most of the time, so don't hold me to it, just for ease of understanding. And so Aquinas thinks something is beautiful if the object in question displays integrity. That's kind of related to coherence. Proportionality, and what he calls brilliancy. It's unclear whether by brilliancy he means something like quite literal, like it's shiny, right? It gives it kind of light, it's got a kind of hue to it, it's got nice colors. He might not, that's debatable. Nonetheless, all of this explanation is on the side of the object. It's like, here's the thing, is it beautiful? What boxes do I check to discern whether it is? Then you have someone like Hume. David Hume has the closest thing to a subjectivist understanding of beauty. As if Aquinas is like, the object is what I care about, Hume is like, look, beauty's got something to do with me. It's got nothing to do with the object. And what's it have to do with me? Good taste. So he's not like a total subjectivist in the sense of like he thinks it's all fair game. He just thinks when we talk about saying something is beauty, we're asking whether the person in question has the appropriate good taste to discern beauty. This is very puzzling because it's like, what are you discerning if there's no beauty out there? It's just in the subject. But nonetheless, it has something to do with good taste in the subject. And how do you get this good taste? Well, you have a strong sense of it. And just in general, I might say if someone's gifted. You have a delicate sentiment. You've begun to cultivate it a little bit. You have the right habits. You've been hanging out with, at art exhibits and talking to people who study art. Maybe don't do that. And you have the right range. You've done all kinds of things. You've experienced all kinds of stuff, both beautiful and ugly. And you lack prejudice in your evaluation of beauty. You've got no obvious self-interest. And so, in this case, like I said, Hume is really putting the onus of beauty on the question of the taste in the subject. But then you have Kant. It goes in a totally different direction. Not entirely, it's still kind of subjective, but for him, famously, if you're familiar with Kant's ethics, deontology, it's about duty. So what's beauty? Beauty is disinterested satisfaction. It's enjoyed for its own sake. Something is beautiful when you've got no skin in the game. You just look at it and go, ah, yes, beautiful. And then you just kind of walk away, right? Take that what you will. Common, right? Beauty is what's ever pleasurable. If it's pleasurable, it contributes to your happiness, you got yourself some beauty. And in this case, of course, beauty starts to look kind of relative, right? Because then it's like, where do I stop here? If it's really just about pleasure, and it's what I want to do, what contributes to my happiness, we start to lose any sense of objective beauty. For you and I to sit around and debate whether this is beautiful or not, is everyone loses that debate, right? Because it just matters what I happen to find pleasing, and human beings can find some pretty perverse things pleasing. So, not a great account. Nietzsche, who I began with our quote, is really where you get hard, like a hard relativism, and an account of power. Beauty is not just relative, but it's whoever is stronger. And we'll spend some time with Nietzsche because I think he's in some sense the best atheist, and he's so important, I think, to our contemporary life. Beauty is will to power. If you're powerful and you exercise it in your own self-interest, glorious. If you're the blonde beast of prey, crushing the skull of the lamb, it's kind of, it's almost this romantic, sort of virulent life force, right? You can kind of see it, the Viking, in the heat of battle, taking lives, getting glory. It's like, beauty, right? And it's true. It's kind of what Nietzsche has in mind, this kind of untamable life that dominates everything in its path. It's beautiful, and we should see it that way. And then finally, there's Freud. Kind of libidinal sublimation here. I don't want to go too deep into Freud, but everything, beauty in particular, is rooted in sexual attraction of some sort of initial sexual pleasure that then, of course, starts to get removed and sublimated in certain ways. So there's obvious ways in which that's the case, like you find someone of the opposite sex attractive, right? Beautiful. But that's not quite what Freud has in mind. And yeah, that's true, but in a higher sense, you start to find things that aren't so obviously related to that attractive. What he thinks you're doing there is you're getting away from the thing you can't have, and you're finding ways of trying to satisfy this desire you have in ways that are socially acceptable. And again, we'll spend some time with Freud as well. And so in this case, things like art are kind of illusory wish fulfillment. I make art because I have some desire that I can't satisfy, that society doesn't want me to satisfy, my clan doesn't want me to satisfy, it gets repressed, I need some way of satisfying it, I'm making art which isn't quite obviously the object of my satisfaction, but nonetheless, it gets the job done. So it's a kind of illusion. I say all this because we're going to touch on each of these thinkers in some way. Each class will kind of parallel some things, so I want to talk about Freud versus Plato, because they both have different accounts of eros, different accounts of desire, and what desire is for, and how it comes to be, and what are its objects, and what role it plays in our lives. I want to talk about Nietzsche in light of the gospel itself, in light of the humble, meek Christ crucified versus Nietzsche's Übermensch, and see those two different accounts of beauty. And I could say more, but we'll touch on each of those. To conclude, a quote from Schmemann: "The term sacramental means here that the basic and primordial intuition which not only expresses itself in worship, but of which the entire worship is indeed phenomenon, both effect and experience, is that the world, be it in its totality as cosmos, or in its life and becoming as time and history, is an epiphany, or theophany, of God, a means of his revelation, presence, and power." And so I want to attempt to unpack what is essentially a kind of Schmemannian account of beauty. That what we are doing here is theophany, and why we care about beauty is theophany, and why we have icons is theophany, and why we engage in liturgy is theophany, and why we baptize people is theophany. And that ultimately all of that is so central to what it means to be human, and teaches us about the world, about ourselves, and ultimately is our eternal destination and union with God.